Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Bridging the Gap. I'm excited and a little nervous about this discussion. I don't know if were you more nervous in preparing for this, Dad?
No, I feel pretty relaxed.
Today we're going to talk about Joseph Smith's first vision. And I think the reason I said nervous is because in the past we've kind of been we talked about a few issues, and we talked about, I think, more ways to approach and hold space for each other, which is good. But now we're talking more to the issues, I think, that separate the nuanced Mormon community from the active Latter-day Saint community, and also for reasons why people have left the church. And so again, we're going to go through some of the issues that are related to core history of the church and the church's narrative on that history. So as we were discussing what perhaps should be the first subject, the first vision seemed appropriate. Dad, you can probably correct me on this, but I don't remember the exact wording. But President Hinckley said, I think in the late 90s, something around the whole veracity of our story hinges on the first vision, and the truthfulness of that narrative. It either happened and we're everything basically that we claim to be, or we're a fraud. So pick. And I kind of grew up, I feel like, with that mentality. I think that's something that works for you. Am I wrong? Like, you kind of like that. Like, that
wholly works for me.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of Latter-day Saints, that's the way that they were raised up. And it makes sense, because then everything else that proceeds out of the prophets and this restoration movement would, of course, be all the work of the Lord. No unhallowed hand can stop the work from progressing. The first vision is something that when you go into the MTC as a missionary, it's one of the first things you memorize. And for me, so I served my mission in the New York Rochester mission and church historic sites. For those of you that know, that is the Sacred Grove. I have spent hours and hours. It'd be interesting to know how many hours I've spent in there. But I have some really good memories of giving tours to the Joseph Smith farm and going to the different homes on that acreage and discussing the events that took place there. And then, of course, the Sacred Grove is why everybody comes, and everybody wants to know, do we think we have an idea where it was? Were any of these trees around when Joseph perhaps went out the back door? And the cabin, when you're there, there's a small cabin it's a replica, but it's built to the same dimensions as the cabin that Joseph Smith would have lived in when he read James 1:5 and decided he needed to ask of God a few questions, which we're going to get into. And he went out the back door and had that sacred experience at the Grove. So, of course, people love to be in that sacred space, follow his footsteps, and go out into the wooded area and contemplate those events. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the narrative, the church currently uses, correct me if I'm wrong, the 1838 edition of the first vision. One of the things we're going to talk about is there are multiple accounts of the first vision. I think the church acknowledges 9, though only 4 were actually Joseph's.
I don't think they were necessarily. I think there were 2 in his hand, and the others that
maybe 2 were dictated by him, and then the rest are like secondhand. Joseph told me this, or
4 are kind of first-hand accounts. I think, and then maybe the other 5 are other narrations. Okay, so the account that we used today in missionary efforts is the 1838 edition that was penned by Joseph himself, and the narrative. Let's see if I remember it. Joseph says, I saw a pillar of light. This can be found in Joseph Smith history. Exactly over my head, above the brightness of the sun, which descended gradually until it fell upon me. And when that light rested upon me, I saw 2 personages whose brightness and glory defy all description, standing above me in the air. One of them spake unto me, calling me by name, and said, pointing to the other, This is my beloved son, hear him. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's additional conversation they must have had, but that particular narrative is in
Joseph Smith history. You can open up the church scriptures and you'll be able to see that. It's in the back of most triple combinations. So the Book of Mormon, the Pearl of Great Price, and then you've got Joseph Smith history section in there. So that version of the story is the most well known. And missionaries globally are memorizing that in multiple languages. My dad can probably recite it in Swedish right now if he had to. Do you still remember it?
Probably, but I wouldn't want to do it for the camera.
No problem. And of course, being on my mission, having that special responsibility, I always considered myself that I had a sacred role, that I was a teller of these stories, and that I got to help people connect to that knowledge in that very sacred space and gain a testimony of those things. Since coming home from my mission, and I came home from my mission in 2009, so you can do the math, but I have studied church history more in depth. When I went out on my mission, I was aware that there were multiple accounts. I kind of feel like I've always known that. We had that kind of relationship in our home where we were discussing things frequently, and my dad being CES and all these books that I was reading, I was aware. So it was kind of something that I was aware of, I had discussed, and I'd gone out on my mission, able to kind of talk about that if someone wanted to. And so it wasn't so much of an issue for me. I am aware that there are many people who had no idea that there are multiple accounts of the first vision. I actually spoke to one of my companions a while ago. She had no idea. She didn't know there were multiple accounts. And our mission president, whom I love and respect, he did a great job. He had taken us out to have a zone conference once in the Sacred Grove. They have different places where you can hold firesides and stuff. And he decided it was important to let the missionaries know that there are multiple accounts, and this is perhaps a way that you can dialogue and talk about these issues. Well, it ruined her. She had never heard of this, and more information she received, she said she just felt her whole mind and soul crumbling. Because it was so upsetting in a challenging way, to the narrative that she had always believed, meaning in her mind it was very clear that Joseph was raised in an environment where he was asking a lot of questions. And so then, of course, at 14 years old, he went out and had this sacred experience with Heavenly Father and Jesus. And that we can do that too, and personal revelation is part of our church. And Joseph was called to be a prophet, and everything from there just kind of fits like a nice puzzle. And then as she was taught from our mission president, she realized it's a little more complicated than that. And so we chatted, and that's different than my lived experience, because again, I had always kind of known. Mm-hmm. And so you have some people that weren't aware of any of it. I think you have people like me that were aware of some of it. And I had learned to talk about that, and my testimony was pretty solid in things that I thought I knew and the witness of the Spirit that I had felt at the time. Where I'm at now, obviously, is a place where I don't feel comfortable saying that I have faith in many of the truth claims of the church. By faith, meaning that I believe that they happened, the way that the church narrative continues to teach that they happened. And this is the reason why. And I'm just going to touch on a few points, and then Dad, if you want to respond, or do you have anything you want to say right now? Because obviously that's kind of how I was raised. That's where I was. I think that's where a lot of people in the church have found themselves. And they're somewhere in that camp, right? In those three places. Don't believe it at all. Or, yeah, I've known that there were multiple visions, but I kind of knew how to deal with it. Or I've never known. So,
multiple accounts of the vision.
Thank you. Yep, multiple accounts. Yep. Keep my terminology straight as I go. So as we had said, there are 9 accounts I think that the church recognizes, 4 that we kind of consider first-hand accounts. The 1838 one being the one that we use in our official church history. I think the earliest, Dad, was 1832. Mm-hmm. Does that ring a... Okay. Mm-hmm. And then I don't know. I think the latest was probably in the mid-1840s, something like that. And all of this is on the church's website. One of the things I did want to say is any information I'm discussing can all be found, and you can verify on the church's website. I know it's important for people to know where our sources are coming from. The church has done a great job in publishing the Joseph Smith papers. And so anything that has come out of that research, you can go online and they have like a digitalized version of those texts, those letters. And a lot of the history that we're talking about comes straight from there. So that's kind of neat. And if you want more information on that, you can send us an email and we will send you some links. But we're not going to get too deep into that. But just know that this content we're talking about is, it's all on the church's website for you to discuss and find, different references for yourself. One of the challenges I've had since my mission, since looking at the church history a little deeper, I think most people know, and the church has done a good job of laying out kind of like a chart that shows the differences between the first vision accounts. And basically those differences can kind of be summarized as, in some of the accounts, he's not talking to God, he's talking to an angelic messenger. In some of the accounts, he's talking to God the Father. In some of the accounts, there are two distinct beings, God the Father and Jesus Christ. And in some of the accounts, there's not a name to this angelic messenger, but in some it's Nephi, and in some it's Moroni. And those tend to be the second-hand accounts, I think. But it's clear that early on, people kind of had different perspectives on what exactly occurred in those narratives. That, on top of the issue that the intent that Joseph had when he went into the sacred grove varies a little bit from account to account. So in the 1838 edition, Joseph is going out there. He's feeling kind of guilty, wanting to know if he's, able to access salvation because he realizes he's imperfect. And he's been listening to all these different narratives from churches around him saying, well, you have to do this for salvation and you have to do this for salvation. So he's wondering which of all these churches are true. And in the 1838 edition, as you continue on to read more of Joseph Smith's history, it seems clear that he went out into the sacred grove and received acknowledgement that God knew him, that his sins were forgiven, and that there was a work for him to do, because none of the churches had the authority on the earth to do what was required for salvation, and that they had fallen far from it, that none of these sects were right. And so that's kind of the idea that we have in our mind when we're discussing the 1838 account. But as you look at the other varying accounts, it's kind of, the emphasis is different. Some of the emphasis hits really hard on the need for salvation, and are you forgiven from God? Is there even a God? Some of the accounts really focus on this idea that none of the churches were correct and that a restoration needed to occur. And it's interesting, depending on the timing of these accounts, it seems that that narrative is somewhat unstable. And so earlier on, if you read the earlier accounts, the focus seems to be on this idea of salvation, knowing that there's a God, knowing that God loves and speaks to his children and that he's the same yesterday, today, and always. And then later on, the account seems to focus more on this idea of a restoration, that Joseph Smith was going to perform these marvelous works and wonders. And it ties into the narrative of the Book of Mormon, that the Book of Mormon was going to come forth and kind of help do this work. So we've got some different aspects of those visions there. But a lot of people want to know, well, if there were two beings and it was God the Father and Jesus Christ, don't you think that that would be consistent in all the narratives? And I don't want to turn this into an apologetics thing. We don't need to do that. There's really great discussions online by persons on both sides of the arguments as to perhaps why those differences occur. But I know that for me, it does raise a flag of concern that it seems that the narrative shifted and evolved from kind of a Trinitarian grace-based perspective to one of two distinct beings. The authority of God needed to be restored to the earth. And when you study church history more in depth, you see that the first edition of the Book of Mormon itself was kind of more Trinitarian. And later on in subsequent editions, certain words were shifted to make it really clear that Jesus was the Son of God versus Jesus being the very eternal Father. Again, kind of a Trinitarian view, that most early church members, if not all, had. And it seems to me that Joseph Smith himself had. And then this idea of two distinct beings, not personages of spirit, were in fact the true nature of God. That theology evolved somewhat. There's other historical documents in Times and Seasons, in some other early church publications, where it seems that the history is a little muddled as to what Joseph Smith was talking about and when in relation to these incredible experiences he had. But in closing, I think it's important to throw out there that today, as President Hinckley had said, when I say today, I mean probably in the last 50 years, if not longer, the heavy emphasis that the church has when we are sharing our story with the world is the first vision. We start with the first vision. As missionaries, we almost always try to get the first vision into a first formal discussion because that was critical. It's very interesting that in early church history up to probably the 1920s, they weren't using it. There aren't established documents, and church scholars have talked about this and recognized it, that show that that first vision was part of the narrative. And in fact, different members of the Quorum of the 12, different people associated with Joseph early on in his ministry, they have differing views of did this even happen and what occurred. And so it's interesting that the emphasis was Book of Mormon for the first initial decades of the church. And then it shifted to this idea of the first vision, which relates to, I think, more priesthood restoration, temple ordinances. All of these things make a little more sense if you start with the first vision versus if there really was no clear first vision and Joseph was simply visited by messengers and the Book of Mormon came forth as a result. So, yeah, those are just some thoughts that I have. Go ahead and why don't you respond to that, Dad, and then we can kind of launch into what do we do about it.
Well, I think for me, whenever I use this expression a lot, making an appeal to the Bible. I think to place the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints into a religious context, you place it into the biblical, to Christianity, New Testament, and to Judaism, Old Testament. And so whenever I try to deal with issues in the church that might be a little challenging, I make an appeal to the Bible. And I do that not because I'm trying to belittle the Bible in any way. In fact, I believe in the Bible, and I believe as we refer to the Bible, we're more accurate in our perspective or our view of a modern church. We view the ancient church, then we can view the modern church.
And I was very much raised that way. I respect that position. I think it's essential.
Yeah. So yeah. If we just view it as a modern thing, we may struggle with some issues.
View it meaning the first vision.
The church.
Okay.
The church today.
Got
the
it.
first vision and everything that's associated with it. We're not really viewing it in its proper religious context, and so we need to view these things in a biblical context. And the early members of the church, they were very much a biblical people. You talked about that perhaps the book of, or the first vision wasn't initially emphasized by them. Mm-hmm. What was initially emphasized is that the people that were attracted to the church were attracted to what they felt were the restoration of biblical concepts.
Because that was a big thing at the time.
It was
People
huge.
were looking for it. This
Apostles
was the second
and
Great
prophets,
Awakening.
authority.
Right.
And so that's what appealed to them from the get-go. You go back and, as Kajsa said, they didn't necessarily use the Book of Mormon as a scriptural document to support the restoration as much as a sign that this came from Joseph. He's a prophet.
Right.
And again, what rang true to these early converts was, who knew their Bible better than probably most people today, was that what the early missionaries and promulgators of the gospel were teaching rang true to them. And this is not just in the United States, it's in Europe and all over where the missionaries went. This was biblical Christianity that they had been looking for, that they felt was lacking in the churches of the day. And when the Latter-day Saint missionaries started preaching, it was like, this is what we've been looking for. So that's what rang true with them. And that's what they emphasized. And so I make an appeal to the Bible then, for you who read the Bible or who believe in Christianity, believe in Judaism, a Judeo-Christian tradition. Let's go to the Bible to see if we can find strength or support to Joseph Smith's claims. And I think we can. I think Judaism's foundational stories are, the Passover. It's the children of Israel captive in Egypt, and they come out of Egypt with this great Passover experience, and through the Red Sea into Sinai, and they receive the word of God from Moses, who speaks with God, and receives tablets miraculously written by the finger of God. Well, these are incredible stories. Do they ring true? Do they ring familiar when we talk about Joseph producing miraculous records? There's certainly a parallel there. When we talk about Christianity, we have these incredible stories of the Annunciation, that Mary's going to conceive miraculously, that Jesus is a miraculous birth, that he had an incredible ministry, including his experience in Gethsemane, his crucifixion and his resurrection. These are foundational experiences for Christianity that are found in the records. So with both Judaism, Christianity, we have foundational documents that tell the story. Well, with Latter-day Saints, we have a miraculous experience, a first vision. And so we have, in all three of these religions then, or these variations of the same religion, I would say, we have miraculous events that happen, and we have records that tell about them. But in the records, we have challenges. And people who are opposed to Judaism take the records of Judaism and they critique and find fault with and challenges with, or whatever we want to call it, that support their position that this is a fable and it was created. Same thing with Christianity.
Documentary hypothesis? Is that what we're talking
No,
about?
we're just saying that, it's these records were stories made up later to support Judaism's story to the world.
But I think it's important to acknowledge that there are many Jews and trained rabbis who embrace that.
There are portions of it, that's
so,
true.
I mean, there are plenty of...
Ultimately, there comes this point where, do you believe God
in, like,
delivered?
The
Do you believe God delivered
okay.
ancient Israel?
Okay.
Do you believe Jesus is indeed divine?
Okay.
Was he?
Sure, agreed.
And for those things, you have.
They have to line up.
Well, no, it's for those things. It's faith.
Sure.
You don't have proof. We don't have the stone tablets that God wrote for Moses.
We don't.
We don't have
some
them.
over here.
We have them, those that I made to use in class. But
Keep talking.
We don't have them.
Keep talking.
Yeah, we don't have them. We don't have we don't have empirical evidence. Yeah, here comes my plates.
I think my dad has so many of
my
these
tablets.
things.
There's
Look,
the stone tablets.
and if you could
exist.
probably hold it closer. He wrote
There's
in
actual
Hebrew.
ancient Hebrew here. So, here you go.
What? So we do have.
This is great.
those
Great.
right
I
over
didn't think about using this prop. This is good. So, we don't have empirical evidence of Israel's deliverance. At least we don't have universal empirical evidence that everybody accepts. Some people say, "Oh yeah, look at this. This gives proof that."
There's always going to be kind of a challenging perspective, right?
And same thing with Christianity. You have Christian scholars who believe there's very solid evidence to Christ's claim of being divine and resurrection, and then you have others who don't believe it.
And I think also some in the camp that you take it on faith.
Yeah,
They admit
absolutely.
perhaps that some. I mean, I've been in classes in graduate school specifically. I never took one, but I was in classes with folks that were taking these apologetics courses, and there are plenty of Christians that feel like you can physically prove the resurrection
Yeah.
through existing historical
Yeah.
narratives, and then the other half of the class is like, no, you can't,
Yeah.
and that's not the intention.
Yeah.
So,
and
it's
I would,
interesting.
Yeah. So, and so I would then, so when I take when I deal with the first vision, the foundational claims of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I put them in this context and say we're in the same boat. If a person wants to take the documentary evidence of the first vision and find reason to not believe in it, they can. If they want to take it and find reason to believe in it, they can as well. I'm one who has studied it to some degree. I'm not an expert on it, but I began studying this pretty intensely as 40 years ago. I read books. I read B.H. Roberts's 1930 Comprehensive History of the Church, which is an interesting example, because Roberts, at that time, there were probably only 2 known accounts of the first vision in 1930. And Roberts discusses them openly in the official history of the church. Wasn't anything secret. There wasn't anything that anybody was trying to hide. And he discusses them. He talks about them. They're probably the only 2 known at the time. I think in 1960, church historians digging through the archives started finding these others.
Specifically, one that Joseph Fielding Smith had locked away in a vault.
I'm not sure about that.
We'll come back to that.
Sure
I'm pretty sure that it had been ripped out of a journal, and it seems like it was intentionally put away because it was questionable. It was like, oh, if this is a Joseph Smith account.
I'm not sure about that. I know something about that story, but I'm not sure if it's exactly this account. But
okay.
At any rate, so in 1970, the church published in the Improvement Era all of these accounts.
And that's an interesting article, and you can find it online.
James Allen wrote it, and it's all 8. They had 8 accounts at that time, and that's where this chart came up, and it chart lists the specific elements of the visions or the accounts of the vision. And much like a harmony of the Gospels in the New Testament, it has all the events. And it tells you if Matthew talks about this, does Mark talk about this, does Luke talk about this, does John talk about it? So in the harmony of the gospel, you see which author talks about which things, and there's great value in that. But there are discrepancies, and because of that, some New Testament scholars and readers have rejected the New Testament and the witness of Christ because they feel like there's discrepancies. And I would say, if you are a careful student of the New Testament and the Gospels, you will find discrepancies much greater than you will in the 8 accounts of Joseph Smith's first vision. I would say there are differences in the first vision accounts, but there aren't discrepancies.
Really?
Yeah, I don't think there are any discrepancies.
So give an example of what a discrepancy versus a difference would be in the first vision.
To say that you saw one person in a vision is different than saying I saw only one person.
Sure.
Joseph never said he saw only one person.
What if you didn't discuss seeing deity at all? What if it was only an angelic messenger versus God the Father and Jesus
called
Christ?
an angel. So to refer to Jesus as an angel, in fact, the Hebrew word...
I think we'd have to discuss that because I've never heard of an account where Jesus was referred to as an angel in a visionary experience.
How about in Lehi's vision in 1 Nephi, chapter 1?
You got to go there with me.
Lehi has a vision.
Okay.
And in the vision, he sees God sitting upon his throne, surrounded with numberless concourses of angels.
Right.
And then he says he saw one of them come down.
Right.
That's Jesus.
Okay, sure. But I think seeing one of them come down, and later on in the text it's identified as Jesus, versus never identifying him as Jesus might be
the text doesn't actually identify him as Jesus. It just is clear from understanding of the text.
Right.
We're talking about Jesus
and
here.
Additional texts that back that up. Okay, so there's one.
Well, I've given you an example, and Jesus is called an angel in the scriptures.
Okay.
So to refer, and an angel is just a messenger.
Right.
The Hebrew word malach means a messenger.
Right.
Angelos means a messenger in Greek.
Yeah.
And so Jesus is the messenger of the covenant. That's what Malachi calls him. He's the ultimate messenger of the Father. So
perhaps in those other accounts, you feel like you can read Jesus into that angelic messenger.
If Joseph used that expression in the text, and he meant it to refer to Jesus, or I wouldn't say he used it to refer to Heavenly Father, but if he used it to refer to Jesus, yes, I can see that being
Yeah.
Jesus.
Okay.
Jesus,
Okay.
because that's what the Father says. He says, "This is my beloved Son. This is my chief messenger."
Yeah.
Hear him.
Yeah. And we see that in
That's
the
what
Old
he is.
Testament, right?
Yeah,
As
so
Christians
again,
looking back.
yeah,
Okay.
so looking at the greater
Fair
context,
enough. Yep. Okay.
I
You don't
would-
see that as
I'm going to make this
problematic.
statement. For me, there are no discrepancies in the accounts of the first vision. There are differences. In the New Testament, there are discrepancies in the gospel accounts of Jesus' life. And there are differences. That's why we have three of them that are called the synoptic gospels, meaning they're taken from the same viewpoint. And John is not one of the synoptic gospels because he differs greatly from some of the other accounts, including the day upon which Christ was crucified. The three synoptic gospels have him being crucified the day after the Passover. John has him being crucified on the day of the Passover when they're offering sacrifices. And so because of this, some people have rejected the idea of Christ's divinity. For me, I love the differing accounts that I find in the Gospels. I remember studying with Steve Robinson, and he was talking about the harmony approach to studying the Gospels, where you read what happened, what Matthew said about this, what Mark said about this, what Luke said about this, and John, and you harmonize them together. And he referred to that as gospel mush.
I like that. Yeah.
And I always thought that was funny. Gospel mush. Well, I like mush myself, so I'm not opposed to gospel mush.
I
think
grew up eating it.
Yeah.
Throw
all kinds of
anything in
mush.
there. Throw anything in
There's
there.
value in the gospel mush, but to some people it's not gospel mush, it's gospel mess. And it gets messy for them. They can't handle it, and the discrepancies and whatever else, just they've lost their faith in Christ. For me, they enhance my faith in Christ as I pull back and say, look, if Matthew wants to stress this point, doesn't mention that, I don't have a problem with it. And if Matthew maybe records something differently than Mark or Luke or John, I don't have a problem with that either. I want to read that and see what was Mark. And Robinson's stress was, he said, don't read the gospel mush. He said, study each gospel account by itself and see what Matthew was trying to say with his account. What's Mark trying to say? What's Luke trying to say? What's John trying to say? And I think there's great value in that. I think there's great value in studying the gospel accounts in both ways. And I ultimately, I think they bear witness of Jesus Christ as the divine Son of God. They bear witness of the resurrection. All of them bear witness of the resurrection. They don't detract from one another. They enhance one another. And if there are discrepancies, well, you know what? Maybe they made mistakes in how they recorded it. Maybe they got some of the narrative wrong. It's possible.
And discrepancies can lead you to asking better questions and finding. I don't want to take over.
No. But so so again, I make an appeal to the Bible.
I like that.
And if you have a problem with 8, 9 different accounts, and boy, I tell you, there are going to be more because I'm a journal reader, and I read old journals,
which is awesome.
And I find in journals things that collaborate and corroborate with church history. I'm reading my old ancient ancestors' journals. Ancient, I mean, like
I was going to say,
my
generations
grandfather
ago.
was born in 1878, so he's pretty ancient. So I'm reading his journals and other journals, and it's marvelous for me when I come across statements that he makes or my grandmother or whoever makes in her journals about the church that collaborate or corroborate with church history and add different insight and personal insight. So for me, these things are really exciting. They add to the richness of the record and people's experience with the stories and whatever else. And so from a biblical perspective, I don't have any problem with multiple accounts. Again, I think there are going to be more because people wrote about these things. They talked about what Joseph taught, and we're going to find more and more records, and I think they're going to substantiate and support the narrative. But ultimately, again, we can't prove it. It's
I like
a spiritual
that.
witness.
It backs up on faith.
It goes back
so
to faith.
I'm going to want to ask you 2 questions, but let me tell you them and then think on it, and so I can get some of my thoughts out. Why then the shift? Why the shift in narrative when initially early church ministry really emphasized Book of Mormon, and then later it seemed to be first vision and then Book of Mormon? Just think about that, because there's definitely a shift.
Yeah.
People were not talking about the first vision. Think about what President Hinckley said in relation to this story is fundamental to who we are.
but it wasn't initially. People didn't know about it. People weren't talking about it. So that's probably the only question right now. But so I like what you're talking about, Dad, with the New Testament, and that the Gospels can complement each other, that there are differences, but you don't have to see it as a detraction. See it as a challenge to maybe ask better questions. I would like to propose, you said that the Gospels have far more discrepancies than the 8 accounts of the first 9.
Well, I think there's 9.
I think there's 9.
Maybe even more.
Then the 9 accounts of the first vision. I would say that that's not a correct perspective. And I would like to alter that perspective and say that the Gospels, you have to equate that to LDS church history. You can't equate the Gospels with the first vision. The first vision was like one account. So you could say, let's look at one account in Jesus' life that all the Gospels talk about and then compare. So when you are studying the first vision, you have to back up and look at all of church history. And I think that's where, at least for people like me, the problems start coming in, which is why on my mission, I was able to go out there and basically say what you just said. That was my approach. It worked for me. But as you step back and start studying, and I will admit, I'll defer to you, you have studied the corpus of church history far more than I have. And it's not complete. We're still learning things, but we definitely, the church has made an effort to publish these things online, but the average person isn't going to go through every page of this. I mean, there are thousands of pages between journals and publications and pamphlets that the church has included with this Joseph Smith Papers project. So it's out there, but it's tough. And if you don't have a scholarly perspective and know where to look, sometimes, it just seems, what's the point? But as I have stepped back and studied church history, it seems to me, it's interesting. You talked about, do you believe that God delivered Israel? And that these specific truths have to tie together in order for our faith in Jesus Christ to tie together, because he was that Redeemer who redeemed Israel. And then, of course, that this idea of a chosen people and priesthood authority all ties together and pops out perfectly with the restoration. I'm one that for a while was pretty nuanced. I'm still nuanced in how I view things, but I like what you said at the end where ultimately our focus should be on Jesus Christ. Now, the divinity aspect, what that means, that we can talk about in another discussion. But I think one of the things I wanted to point out is I think you would have to be decidedly naive to say that from a Christian perspective, the history of the Old Testament and the New Testament put together, prophecy being fulfilled, was not somewhat proof texted, was not somewhat edited to help these things come together. And that's, to me, so what I'm saying is we see that in LDS church history. And it's not necessarily a problem, but I think it is a problem when you acknowledge it in the Old Testament and the New Testament, but then you won't acknowledge it in church history. Meaning, to me, I think it's very clear once we start to study the greater church history that Joseph's theology developed.
Yeah. Can I comment on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
I absolutely believe that I wrote a paper and delivered it once at Society of Biblical Literature on Swedish Bible translation. We were dealing with different Bibles in Sweden, and we were trying to pick which one we wanted to use as a church, because we don't have the KJV, King James Version, Swedish version of the KJV. So we pick a Swedish version, and we had used an old traditional version for years. I made an extensive study of the various Bible translations since the early Gustav Vasa back in like 1521. It was fabulous, and I studied all these different versions, and I thought, man, and I did that as part of my work to recommend a Swedish Bible for the saints, because 2 Bibles had recently come out, one that was kind of a liberal translation, and one that was more conservative, and so it was a response to that previous translation. And these translations, it was interesting to see how they presented the Old Testament, particularly because the one that was more evangelical, they had proof text, as you said. and they had taken Old Testament passages that we believe are messianic. They have certainly an application, and the New Testament writers use them. They use them. Matthew,
right? He's always connecting the prophecies.
But what they had done is they had gone back in the Old Testament and they had capitalized certain things, like Psalms 2, where we have the great throne or coronation psalm. Thou art my son; this day I have begotten thee, and Christians use that, and the New Testament writers use that. Jesus, I think, even used it to show his divinity, but in this translation, they had capitalized these words in the Old Testament, which I felt was a wrong choice, because what it did is it only emphasized the New Testament's proof texting or usage of that passage, and didn't allow that passage to have meaning in its own time. And I think what we see in the Old Testament is there are all kinds of things that happen in the Old Testament, not only prophecies, but events, such as Joseph being a type of Christ. Clearly, Joseph is a type of Christ in the Old Testament, meaning that what he did to deliver his brothers was symbolic of what Jesus Christ would do to deliver the world. But to go back and capitalize every time it refers to Joseph as if that's Jesus would be wrong. And the folk Bible did that to some extent, and by doing so, it robbed the text from its initial then and there meaning, and I think that's wrong. And so I do believe that there are things in Old Testament and in New Testament and in even early church history that are there and can be used later on by prophets, seers, revelators, scholars, whatever, personal study.
In like contemporary theology, they call that useful history.
Yeah.
It's fertile. You can take it and then grow a new approach
so
to
I'll give you
it,
an
which
example.
I'm really passionate about.
So when the Declaration of Independence was written, it uses the phrase that we believe that all men were created created with certain inalienable rights, created equal. Well, that didn't mean what it meant. When they wrote that in 1776, it didn't mean what it came to mean later on. And one of the chief promulgators of a different meaning of that text was Abraham Lincoln. When Abraham Lincoln used those same words 7 years later, is that what it said? Yeah.
I don't know.
He used those words to mean something wholly different. He used them to mean that the blacks, the slaves, were equal. That's not what the original writers of the Declaration intended. It appears to have intended.
And then there's the story of women.
Yeah, then there's the story of women. Absolutely. So Lincoln, he takes this text and he reads into it what it needs to be said in 1868. And I said, I'm okay with that. He's the leader of the nation. He's taking our founding documents. He's saying, look what it says here. What's incredible to me is that they said the phrase. They created the vessel in which later revelation or inspiration or politicalization could be used to promote a cause. And it was, and it happened. And we made advances. We're still working on that, as you say, Kajsa. We're still trying to work on that. So I believe the scriptures are pregnant with all kinds of types, shadows, prophecies, whatever, that later people can use, and I would say God uses his prophets to bring meaning to a current culture and time from something that maybe wasn't even initially thought to be intended towards that usage.
So
but now it's very, very valuable.
Bringing that back to the issue of the multiple accounts of the first, because I love everything you're saying, but I'm not sure that supports your view.
So in
on
the multiple accounts, again, I don't think there are any discrepancies. I think Joseph had an experience. A picture paints 1,000 words. He didn't write a 1,000-page essay. He had an experience. And Joseph was able to, as he was growing, to look back on that first vision and draw out things he actually experienced from that vision to better teach and promote the ongoing process of ongoing revelation in his time. So in other words, he was able to draw upon his literal experience and bring out certain aspects of that literal experience later on to emphasize things he needed to emphasize at that time. I don't have a problem with that. I'm a journaler.
So
I've been writing journal for over 40 years.
So let me just take one. Okay, with respect to what you just said, let me take one historical thing that I think is indisputable that we could agree on with church history. So let's just say the first vision took place in 1820. Let's say Joseph was 14 years old, and that we believe everything to have been said the way that the 1838 account reads. Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah.
In that discussion, Joseph was taught what about the different Christian sects of the time?
He was taught that none of them possessed authority.
Yeah.
They were not his churches.
Right, and that he
That
should
they
join
had-
none of them?
That he should join none of them. That they had they had portions of truth, but they didn't have the entire truth. And
that's a pretty clear, and that's something that we discuss a lot as missionaries. It's a point of our theology. But yet later on, Joseph decides he wants to align himself with the Methodist sect.
that's not correct.
Okay, help me understand that, because that used to bother me.
He did not join the
He
Methodist
didn't
Church.
join it.
Yeah.
But he attempted.
He said, I felt somewhat partial towards the Methodist sect,
Yeah.
but he kept himself aloof.
But if
from all
he
the
already
parts.
knows, why even?
Because there were elements within Methodism that he still was left alone, and there were things that still resonated.
Right.
I think it shows the egalitarianism of Joseph. Even though he was told flatly that these churches are not true, Joseph defended the other religions.
Well,
and he
you
even
see
felt
elements
affinity.
of that
Absolutely.
theology. That's another point of interesting conversation, I think, is you look at what was happening at that time. The LDS Church is not the only restorationist church. We are probably one of the most successful ones for sure, that has continued to progress since its origins. But when you look at, I remember when I was tracting, this one time this guy let me in his cool old house in one of these little townships, and he's like, oh, you guys are restorationists. So of course my interest peaked. I'm like, yeah, we are. He's like, my great grandmother was the prophet of this church right around the corner, and he had this painting of her, and so he starts telling me this history. So it was cool to see. Again, it was excitement.
Yeah.
People were talking about these things. But in relation to the first vision, I think it's interesting to also acknowledge the histories of these other contemporary movements having near similar experiences.
I think
How is one, are we just to assume that Joseph's was authentic, but theirs weren't?
Well, again, that comes down to individual choice and so forth. If again,
Because and accounts before Joseph's experience that he probably would have known about if he's following this religious excitement.
sure.
Which is why, and then I'll end and you can take off from here, Dad, because we'll try and keep it to 10 or 15 more minutes. I, at this point, am very comfortable looking at my Latter-day Saint, the religion of my birth, from a mystical lens. Some people hate that. They think it's ridiculous. But let me tell you why. I think you can look at church history and take your perspective, or take my perspective with the nuance and the mess, seeing it more as a bowl of mess versus a bowl of mush, like you said, and still appreciate things that were ultimately done to lead us to, if we believe that we're a Christian faith and the Christian faith, a faith in Christ. I believe that whatever perspective you want to take of Joseph Smith having that experience, you can say Joseph was a seeker. He was trying to connect with God, and his account reflects that God connects with each and every one of us. And that was something that was blasphemous at the time. But as you taught me in my youth, the story of the children of Israel is a story that can be applied to us. The narrative of God's relationship with Israel is a type and shadow of his relationship to us. The covenants that he makes with us that we're constantly breaking, but he doesn't. He's always there. He's continuously trying to reach out. And so I think whether you look at it and say it all happened exactly the way it says, or obviously it's messy and maybe Joseph kind of embellished later on and he gathered from his own experiences and that of others to create this narrative, I think the end result, if we're talking faith in Christ, I don't see how, so for example, for me, those stories in the Old Testament put a fire in my bosom just as they ever did, but I do not view them as literal. I'm open to it, but I absolutely don't, because from what I've studied from contemporary scholarship and Jewish scholars, I don't need it to be literal. And I think sometimes when we're talking about fertile theology, we are in this place right now in church history that, I mean, we haven't had this drop in missionaries since like the 40s, the 50s. Our numbers are stagnant. They're not declining, but if it continues on the trajectory we're on, it's declining. Where people are troubled. And I think that if we hold space for a more nuanced perspective and focus on our love for Christ, does it matter? Like, do we have to make such dogmatic points about this theology that apparently wasn't that important for the first half of the church's history? Those are just thoughts.
Well,
so I can see Joe's. I feel like Mormonism is a mystical movement. That's how I look at it.
First off, the church is not declining in numbers. That's an incorrect statement.
How can you say that?
They just published the most recent.
I'm talking about trends.
Well, we've slowed in our growth.
That's what I said.
Yeah. But we're not declining in our numbers. We're still growing.
But barely. And if we continue on this trajectory,
like
it's going to flip. It's going to flip.
Okay, well, you can...
I mean, we'll see. But I think you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, no, I don't necessarily agree with what you're saying.
Okay,
but there is certainly a change in what people kind of anticipated perspective.
Well, because 10 years ago, the church was projecting that at this point we'd be over 20 million.
Yeah, well, I would just go back to early church history and say there were periods of great persecution when the church declined. Half of the original 12 apostles left the church. And everybody thought it was all. They thought it was all over, and it's not all over, and it's not going to be all over. So
we have some.
You hold tight. You keep watching.
Okay.
But let me share something.
You better
here.
live for a long time, Dad, so we can keep having these discussions.
Yeah, I will, or I'll come back from the grave and talk to you. So let me just read something here. I said the same criticism, I kind of said this, but these are some notes. She said, the same criticism that is expressed against the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its sacred writings has been or could be expressed against Judaism, Christianity, something I talked about earlier, and the Bible. One might even say Islam. As I thought about this, I came across an article written by a fellow by the name, he was a PhD, his name's Tim M. Siegler, and he has an article called "The Top 10 Attacks Against the Bible's Historical Reliability," and he makes this statement, which I think is interesting. Many skeptics have challenged that the Scriptures merely provide modern readers with myths and literary fictions from the ancient world. And again, this is not by a member of my church. This is a Christian writer, and he's making this statement. Upon this basis, they deny the Bible's truth claims and reject the need for personal faith. These attacks against the Bible's historical value are nothing new, and they won't be going away anytime soon. But the real problem is that most of these historical claims are aimed at eliminating the more important religious truth claims made in the Scriptures. So I think that's really important. So these attacks against the historicity are really aimed, he's saying, against the more important religious aspects of the Christianity and their claims. He says if the Bible's historical claims are not true, it would be right to doubt its religious ones. Paul, the first century rabbi and apostle, cautioned believers at Corinth, if the Messiah has not been raised, then our preaching is vain. If your faith also is vain. Moreover, we are even found to be false witnesses of God because we witnessed against God, or by the name of God, that he raised the Messiah, whom he did not raise. One could similarly say that if the Exodus did not occur, our Passover-informed faith in the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world is in vain. And I could read more of this, but I think, okay, so this logic can effectively be applied to one's belief in the modern church and its scripture. For example, if the Messiah has not appeared to Joseph Smith, then our preaching is vain, President Hinckley. Mm-hmm. And your faith also is vain. And so this idea then, if these foundational concepts, Christ is divine, he literally resurrected from the dead, he is the Son of God. If we discount those things, our faith is vain. If we discount the first vision and say it's just a mythical thing and Joseph just contrived it, then really the faith claims of the divinity of the church are they're no more valid than the other restorationist movements.
Sure, sure.
And so, as a Latter-day Saint, we do have to stand those grounds. We do have to hold on to those things if we're going to claim that we have a unique position in God's latter-day work. Just as Christians have to hold to the divinity of Christ as divine, and not just another great historical religious figure. If he's divine, it means everything.
Yeah.
If he's another religious figure, well, okay, you can follow Christianity or you don't have to. If Joseph Smith really did have a conversation with God the Father and Jesus Christ, that makes all the difference. If he didn't, well, then it's just another restorationist movement with some good stuff and maybe some bad stuff.
Two things. First off, in that quote, I don't disagree with what he's saying, but I do disagree with his verbiage. A question is not an attack.
Okay,
And hold on, and I want to say that again. A question is not an attack.
Mm-hmm.
And I, as one, the only reason people such as myself are still engaged in this dialogue is because love.
Yeah.
I love the aspects of my childhood that opened me up to God and values and ethics that made me want to be like Jesus. The very image of his feet with sandals and they're dirty and because he's in the work. That is, I consider myself a disciple. I'm not too worried about his Christology. I'm more worried about, am I living as he would have me live? Because I really think that's what matters, but we can debate that another time. So again, attacks,
yeah, I agree.
questions, not the same thing. And I think
agree.
the minute people start having serious discussion, unfortunately, a lot of people shut down because they're like, attack, you're attacking my faith. It is important to understand, as we've talked about in our other episodes, these things are emotionally charged. Mm-hmm. When the potential for something you thought you always understood is shifting, you're going to have an emotional response. Because you're like, don't challenge. I know what I know. Mm-hmm. I have had some very emotional experiences where I know what I know. And then that changes. And I mean, we have to give space for that. Mm-hmm. I've had very sacred experiences where I came to later find out that that person, by sacred, I mean full of love and trust and connection, was a fraud. And so I think we have to hold both and continue on our walk as best we can. Plenty of times people have had these passionate feelings about something, and then they find out, for example, their marriage, what's been going on behind closed doors this whole time. Right. So I don't mock that sacred feeling because I still work with it. I love it. But the way I choose to look at it is in a greater perspective of my connection to the divine and in the universe, God, heavenly parents, trying to acknowledge you're part of me. Mm-hmm. I'm part of you. Mm-hmm. We're on this path. I don't know. I think that...
I think that's a good point.
Well, because...
But and I think we have to acknowledge the fact that very conservative Christians, Latter-day Saints, Jews, whatever, they do feel like they're being attacked sometimes. And they maybe need to... and they maybe are being attacked sometimes.
Sure. Oh, and I mean, again, definitely.
Both if we're
there's the worst of both kinds on the extremes.
We need to become gentle. in our discussions. Can I read one more little thing?
Yeah, and then I had one more quick question. Okay, bam.
Well,
go ahead.
I made a comment, and Kajsa jumped in, that I have been keeping a journal for over 40 years.
He's great.
And I dig into my ancestors' records and letters. I have my grandfather's and grandmother's letters. I have journals, and it's interesting to see that something. And I try to. I'm digitizing these, sending them out to my family, and sometimes Grandpa will say something in his journal. And then in a letter, there's much more information in the letter. Well, there are two different accounts. In fact, sometimes they don't contradict each other necessarily, but the two different accounts add so much color. And then when Grandma comments back, it's like a third account. Mm-hmm. It's wonderful. Well, this is what I wrote in conclusion to my thoughts today. It says, as one who has created and kept many records for many years, I have great confidence in the records. Rather than dismiss them, I think we need to take them seriously and study them and learn from them. We may be quite amazed someday to find out that those ancient records didn't need as much interpretation as we supposed, but do in reality describe things as they really were, as foreign to our modern imagination as we might find them to be. I go back with my wife and we read my journal. This is our 40th year anniversary. We'll read journal accounts. We've forgotten some of the funny details of our courtship and our early dating. And we read these accounts, it's like, oh, wow. And then sometimes it brings back a memory and we remember, and then other times we can't even remember it. But I have great confidence in the records. I believe that God gave us scriptures. They're not perfect. They came through imperfect people. But I think through them we can discover God. And so enjoy them. Don't cast them out, because there's a difference. But take some time to get comfortable with them.
I like that quote. Thank you, Dad. And I like that quote that you shared of these documents, as we receive new information, should not be thrown out. That is a principle that can be applied to whether you find yourself in the literalist path or the nuance path. Don't throw them out. Hold space for the differences. Ask questions of surrounding what could this mean? And that's how I want to end, is what if? And just think, and the reason I say that is because I feel like early Mormonism has the usable history, the fertile history to develop into new theology that, as I've studied Mormon history, I see that's how it's been the whole time. Meaning, as I look at the instances of the first vision, I see this. I see there was a shift in narrative because it served our purpose as a people. Initially, Joseph wasn't talking about this experience. And as we study the record, the early experiences look different than the later experiences as far as accounts. There's differences, whether you want to call those discrepancies or not, there's differences. I think one of the earliest is Lucy Mack Smith talking about it in her journal. Lucy remembers that discussion happening in the grove between Joseph and Nephi. Doesn't matter, maybe not, I don't know. But to me, if we can hold space and say that perhaps Joseph, we don't know exactly when, but we know that he, at one time or at many times, had sacred experiences where he communed with the divine, I think that leaves flexible interpretive room for what we're dealing with right now in regards to our relationship with Heavenly Mother, our desire for advanced theologies, our relationship to our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, and our desire for advanced theologies. Answers to questions that we don't have, which I think the nuanced Mormons are saying, if you're telling me you have a direct link to God and you're talking to God and God is revealing things that are critical for our life on earth, they feel very left out when, for example, their family members are committing suicide because the current attitudes and past teachings of the church on the LGBTQ community are void of Jesus. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it makes sense to me. That we, rather than being dogmatic that it happened exactly a certain way, let's hold space for the reality that maybe it didn't exactly happen that way, and that is our tradition. It's a mess. And we can still, as a people, hold to our values and our good lived experiences and reinterpret that for something greater. It doesn't work for everybody. But to me, I at least hold space for it. That's all I'm going to say. So, yeah. You didn't answer my question. Why the shift in narrative? We both got distracted.
I kind of answered it.
If you could maybe answer it in like 2 sentences.
Again, I don't think there's so much a shift in narrative as maybe there's an emphasis of certain elements of the narrative that needed to be emphasized.
Sorry, I wasn't asking my question correctly. Why wasn't the first vision discussed as a missionary point and as general church knowledge? I mean, really, until the 1920s.
I'm not sure I can fully answer that. I think Bushman and others, other church historians, have discussed that quite a bit. So I'm not sure I could add much to it.
What are your thoughts? Just maybe your thoughts. Because to me, it seems strange that something so pivotal and profound. I mean, I've heard general conference talks where at that moment.
Well, I don't think that really matters, because we know before Joseph died in 1838, he is penning this official, what becomes kind of the official narrative. That's 1838. That's way early. And so you talk about maybe the lack of emphasis of using
Early
it.
in
It really
Joseph's.
doesn't matter.
I mean, early
but
in...
it was Joseph put it out there, and he talked about two beings.
But I also think it's important to note what had happened before then. Joseph was starting to practice polygamy and teach it on a very small scale. In order for this idea of eternal families and sealings, the nature of God has to change. It has to change. And then we have the changes in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. Well, again...
And we can talk about that when we talk about...
As far as
Book of
you're
Mormon.
talking about not really emphasizing until 1920 or whatever, it was there. It was in the documents. It was published in the Pearl Great Price. That account
The
has been there.
1838 account wasn't published for decades.
Initially, no, it was. It was published in 1842 in the Times and Seasons.
Right, but when the Book of Commandments and the initial doctrine,
no, it was published early. It was purportedly written or dictated in 1838. It gets published in 1842, prior to the Wentworth letter, which is another 1842 account of the first vision. But that account, which talks about dual members of the Godhead appearing to Joseph, was in place. It was there.
Do you think it was seen as scripture?
Joseph said,
I mean,
owing
it's
to the
tricky.
many
Things were
reports we
different.
put in circulation, I'm going to give you an official account. And so
It
this is
seems
from Joseph.
convenient to me.
It's not Lucy's account saying,
Right,
I think he
right.
saw Nephi out there. No, this is Joseph talking pretty lucidly, 1838, and he's trying to give us a true account due to all the spurious and other accounts out there. He says, this is what really happened. Here it is, folks.
Okay.
So I'd say that you want to find out what really happened, focus on that one. The other ones will add, the other accounts will give color and other ideas and contribute, but I don't think they'll contradict that. That account.
And I would just close, as you research history, you can better understand perhaps the first vision accounts, not just studying them side by side with each other, but the greater LDS church history at the time, perhaps why things were said the way they were, and perhaps not. I mean, I don't know. But we'll be talking about the Book of Mormon. What are we talking about next?
Well, we'll probably have to discuss that. Maybe the Book of Mormon.
I think so.
Okay.
So thank you for the discussion. One of the reasons I had said earlier that I was kind of nervous to have this is people have very powerful feelings about these things. I was able to, this is probably some pride speaking, good missionaries are also good entertainers to some extent, because these stories are awesome to talk about. And
Absolutely.
I was good at telling these stories, and I have some very precious moments of being in these sacred spaces, sharing that story and being, tears all around with these tours, and it was so powerful. But it wouldn't have been that powerful, I think, had we been using any other version. So there's some thoughts to think about that, but hold space for each other's sacred feelings. Just because you had those feelings and I'm perhaps challenging, did it happen exactly that way, doesn't mean your feelings about God's love for you and acknowledgement of you as his child are wrong.
Yeah.
At all. These things are real. It's how we look at them. And so hold space for that. Thanks, everyone. We went a little bit over, but we're trying.
Yeah.
So, all right. Have a great week. We'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.